All right, so today we're diving into something a bit different, a side of American history we don't usually talk about in school.
Oh, yeah.
Presidential sex lives?
Definitely not G-rated.
Yeah, we're going beyond the textbook version today and getting into some pretty personal stuff.
It is fascinating, though. It really is a kind of unique window into how power, gender roles, even our ideas about privacy and scandals have changed throughout history.
It's true. And we'll be looking at an episode of the podcast Betwixt the Sheets, historian Eleanor Herman.
Right, the author of Sex with Presidents.
She really gets into some juicy details with the host, Kate Lister.
Yeah, and our goal today is to sort of explore those connections between power and let's say less than ideal choices.
Right.
And we're also going to look at how public and media attitudes towards presidential indiscretions have shifted over time.
Okay, so first things first, we got to acknowledge that not every president had this, scandalous personal life.
Oh, for sure.
Some were a bit more traditional
Definitely.
relationships. George
Yeah.
Washington, for example.
Yeah, from what we know, Washington was pretty reserved. I think the most exciting piece of information we have is that early unconsummated crush on a neighbor's wife.
Oh, yeah.
Little bit of unrequited love, but not exactly a headline-grabbing scandal.
Not quite. I mean, that does make me wonder, though, was it more common for presidents in earlier eras to just kind of keep their personal lives under wraps? Or were they just genuinely less prone to, stepping out?
That's a great question. I think it's probably a combination of both factors, right? Societal norms were different. The press generally avoided prying into the private lives of public figures. But there's also this concept called hubris syndrome that might play a role.
Okay, let's unpack that. What is hubris syndrome and how does it relate to presidents?
Okay. So hubris syndrome is a psychological disorder that can develop in individuals who hold positions of power for extended periods. It's characterized by a cluster of symptoms: excessive confidence, disregard for criticism, a sense of being above the rules,
Oh, wow.
even a belief in one's own infallibility.
Basically, it's like a power trip gone too far.
Yeah, in a nutshell, yes. And while it affects both men and women in positions of power, it seems to manifest differently.
Oh, so you mean women are, immune to this syndrome?
Not at all. Women in power can certainly exhibit hubris. We've seen this with figures like Margaret Thatcher or Indira Gandhi. But there's a noticeable difference. Women leaders, even when displaying hubris, haven't historically shown the same tendency towards sexual recklessness that we've observed in some male leaders.
That raises a lot of interesting questions about gender roles and expectations, for sure,
Right.
which we'll definitely get into later. But for now, let's shift our focus to a president whose life really kind of illustrates this complex interplay of power, personal choices, and evolving public attitudes. Thomas Jefferson,
Yes, a brilliant mind, a founding father.
but also a slave owner.
Right, with a very controversial personal life.
Yeah, the Jefferson dilemma. It's a tough one to reconcile. He fathered several children with Sally Hemings, an enslaved woman.
And yet never granted her or their children freedom.
I mean, it's a blatant contradiction to his ideals of equality and liberty.
It is, and it's especially jarring when you consider how significant his role was in shaping the very foundations of American democracy.
Absolutely.
And to think at the time such relationships tragically were not uncommon.
Did public perception just overlook this aspect of his life because of his accomplishments?
It seems like there was a degree of acceptance or at least tolerance of such behavior within the political climate of the era. And keep in mind, this was long before DNA evidence definitively confirmed the paternity,
Right.
which adds another layer of complexity to the story.
That's wild. Can you imagine a modern-day presidential candidate trying to navigate a situation like that?
I can't.
The media scrutiny would be relentless.
Absolutely. That's a perfect illustration of how much has changed. For a significant part of the 20th century, a gentleman's agreement existed among journalists.
The gentleman's agreement.
Presidential affairs were rarely reported, almost as if there was this collective effort to protect the image of the office.
So presidents like Woodrow Wilson, Warren Harding, even FDR, all of whom had extramarital relationships. They managed to keep these affairs largely out of the public eye.
It's almost like there were two different realities.
Right.
The private lives of these powerful men, and then the carefully crafted public image that was presented to the world.
Precisely. The presidency was viewed with such reverence that these personal indiscretions were often just swept under the rug. But this culture of silence, it began to crumble as the press became more skeptical of authority.
Right.
And we can't talk about this shift without mentioning JFK.
Oh, of course not.
If any president embodies both the allure and the dangers of unchecked power, it's him. His actions seem to be a textbook case of hubris syndrome.
JFK's behavior was, without a doubt, reckless. The podcast goes into some pretty shocking details. He was apparently cheating on Jackie during their honeymoon,
Really?
which is just...
It's almost unbelievable. And using Jackie's own bed for his tryst without even changing the sheets.
I know. I mean, that's brazen on a whole other level.
There's stories about staff finding other women's hair and bobby pins in the sheets, leading to some very awkward moments, especially considering Jackie's iconic style and her signature hairstyle,
Right.
and Jackie finding another woman's underwear under her pillow. How could she have been unaware of what was happening?
It's important to remember the social context of the time. Publicly acknowledging these rumors, let alone confronting them, would have been incredibly difficult for a woman in her position.
That's true.
Yeah.
It makes you think about the immense pressure and scrutiny that first ladies faced and still face today.
For sure.
And beyond the personal betrayal, JFK's recklessness also posed some serious national security risks.
Oh, absolutely. His affairs weren't just with random women. Some were suspected spies, which is a whole other level of concerning behavior.
Yeah, it's mind-boggling that he got away with so much for so long. Why didn't the press expose him?
Well, that goes back to the gentleman's agreement we discussed earlier. Journalists believed that prying into the personal lives of politicians, especially the president, was off limits. It was considered a matter of respect for the office.
But surely that kind of deference couldn't last forever. Something had to give.
You're absolutely right. A series of events in the 1960s and 70s chipped away at that culture of silence. The Vietnam War and its associated deceptions made the press much more wary of blindly trusting the government. Then there was the Chappaquiddick incident with Ted Kennedy, a story the press had suppressed for years, which further eroded public trust. And finally, Watergate exploded onto the scene, shattering any remaining illusions about the sanctity of the presidency.
So essentially, Watergate gave journalists permission to go after the president, even if it meant delving into their personal lives.
Exactly.
It was a complete 180 from the era of JFK.
Once that dam broke, the floodgates opened and all those suppressed stories about JFK's affairs came pouring out, leading to countless books and tell-all interviews.
It's amazing how a single event can have such a profound and lasting impact on media coverage.
And on public perception as well.
Absolutely. It makes you wonder, would JFK have been as reckless if he knew the press wouldn't protect him? We'll delve into that and more in the next part of our deep dive. So we've been talking about how the media landscape shifted drastically after Watergate, leading to much more scrutiny of presidents' personal lives.
Right.
But does that increased scrutiny actually change their behavior? I mean, do presidents learn from these historical scandals?
It's the big question, isn't it? And it's one that Eleanor Herman really grapples with in Sex with Presidents. You know, she seems to believe that despite the risks, the allure of power and the temptations that come with it are incredibly difficult to resist.
So she's suggesting that even with the constant threat of exposure, some presidents might still fall into the same patterns of behavior.
Exactly. And that brings us back to hubris syndrome. Remember, it's not just about making calculated risks.
Right.
It's about a distorted sense of reality, a belief that one is above the rules, immune to consequences.
So even if a president is intellectually aware of the risks, this syndrome could cloud their judgment and lead them to believe they can get away with anything.
Precisely. It's a powerful psychological force that can override even the most rational decision-making processes.
And let's not forget the role of the public. Voters often seem willing to overlook personal transgressions, especially if they believe the president is doing a good job in other areas.
That's a crucial point. Think about Thomas Jefferson. Even with the rumors about his relationship with Sally Hemings circulating, he was reelected.
Wow.
It suggests that voters prioritize certain aspects of a president's performance over their personal lives.
Yeah, that makes sense. If the economy is booming and the country feels secure, voters might be more inclined to forgive a president's personal failings.
Right.
It raises the question, has our tolerance for these sorts of indiscretions actually increased over time?
It's certainly possible social norms have shifted, and what might have been a career-ending scandal decades ago might barely register today. Think about how our attitudes towards sexuality, privacy, and even power dynamics have evolved.
It's a fascinating paradox, isn't it?
It is.
We demand more transparency from our leaders than ever before, yet we also seem more forgiving of certain behaviors that were once considered taboo.
It speaks to the complexities of our relationship with power and our evolving expectations of those who hold it. We want our leaders to be both relatable and exceptional, which can create a difficult balance to strike.
It definitely makes me wonder if the 24/7 news cycle and the rise of social media have made presidents more cautious or just more skilled at managing their public image.
That's a great question. It's likely a combination of both. The constant scrutiny can certainly act as a deterrent,
Uh,
but it also forces politicians to become more savvy about how they present themselves and control the narrative.
it's almost like a high-stakes game of chess, where every move is analyzed, every
Yeah.
statement dissected, and even the smallest slip-up can be amplified and weaponized in the blink of an eye.
Exactly. And this brings us back to a crucial point raised by Eleanor Herman's work, the persistent double standard that exists for men and women in positions of power.
Right. We touched on this earlier when discussing the differences in how hubris syndrome seems to manifest in men and women. It seems women are judged much more harshly for their personal choices, especially when it comes to matters of sexuality.
Think about it. Could a woman with JFK's history of infidelity ever become president?
Honestly, probably not. She'd likely be labeled as untrustworthy, unstable, or unfit for office.
Whereas a man with a similar past might be able to downplay it as useful indiscretion or even boast about his conquests.
It's incredibly frustrating.
It is.
It's as if society expects women to be morally impeccable while simultaneously holding them to a different standard of leadership. It feels like a no-win situation.
It highlights the deeply ingrained gender biases that still permeate our culture. And these biases aren't just limited to sexuality. Think about how female leaders are often criticized for being too assertive or too emotional, while male leaders exhibiting similar traits are praised for being strong and decisive.
It's as if we're still operating under the assumption that women in power should conform to traditional feminine ideals, while men are given much more leeway to defy expectations.
It speaks to the limitations of our collective imagination when it comes to envisioning women in positions of power. We're still struggling to reconcile the image of a powerful woman with traditional notions of femininity.
And that struggle has real consequences for women who aspire to leadership roles.
Yeah.
It creates a double bind that makes it even harder for them to succeed.
It also perpetuates the idea that power is inherently masculine, which reinforces existing power structures and limits opportunities for women.
This brings us to another interesting question. If a male president were to come out as gay, how would that impact his presidency and public perception?
That's an intriguing question and one that's difficult to answer definitively. We've seen a significant shift in public attitudes towards LGBTQ plus individuals in recent years, but it's unclear how that would translate to the highest office in the land.
There's never been an openly gay president of the United States, so we're essentially in uncharted territory here.
Right?
But we do have James Buchanan, who many historians believe was gay.
Right, and his story's a fascinating one. He was the only lifelong bachelor president, and his close relationship with William Rufus King fueled speculation even during his lifetime.
People were calling them Mr. and Mrs. Buchanan and Aunt Nancy and Miss Fancy, which, from what I understand, were common euphemisms for gay couples at the time.
And let's not forget the mysterious burning of Buchanan's personal papers by his nieces and nephews after his death. What secrets were they trying to hide?
It certainly adds to the intrigue. Unfortunately, we may never know the full story due to the lack of concrete evidence and the societal constraints of the time.
Exactly. And it's important to approach these historical figures with sensitivity and respect, recognizing the limitations of our knowledge and the complexities of their lives.
Absolutely. And while we're on the topic of presidents whose personal lives have been subject to much speculation, we can't leave out Abraham Lincoln. There have been persistent rumors about his sexuality as well.
The evidence for Lincoln's supposed homosexuality is largely based on his close relationship with Joshua Speed, with whom he shared a bed for several years when they were young men.
But wasn't that a fairly common practice in the 19th century?
Yes,
It didn't necessarily imply anything sexual?
you're right. Sharing a bed with a same-sex friend was considered perfectly normal at the time, and there's no evidence from contemporary accounts or personal letters to suggest that their relationship was anything other than a close friendship.
So it seems like those rumors are more a product of modern speculation than historical fact. It's a reminder that we should always be cautious about imposing our contemporary values and interpretations onto the past.
Exactly. It's crucial to consider the historical context and avoid projecting our own assumptions onto figures who lived in very different times.
So we've discussed presidents who were rumored to be gay, but what about presidents whose marriages were less about scandal and more about complex dynamics and evolving expectations?
That brings us to FDR and Eleanor Roosevelt, a couple whose relationship defied traditional norms and reflected the shifting social landscape of the 20th century.
From what I've read, they were deeply committed to each other and their shared goals, but their marriage was far from conventional.
That's a great way to put it. They were intellectual equals and political partners.
Yeah.
But their personal relationship was strained by incompatibility and, by some accounts, a lack of physical intimacy.
Eleanor in particular seemed to find traditional wifely duties stifling and ultimately sought fulfillment outside of the confines of her marriage.
Her long-term relationships with women, most notably Lorena Hickok, highlight the double standard that existed then and sadly still exists today. A female politician having multiple affairs would be a career-ending scandal, while a male politician often gets away with it.
It's a stark reminder that the rules of the game are different for women, even those in positions of power.
And those double standards extend beyond sexuality. Women are often judged more harshly for their ambition, their assertiveness, and even their emotional expression. It creates a challenging landscape for women who aspire to leadership roles.
It also makes you wonder how history might have unfolded differently if women had been given the same opportunities and afforded the same freedoms as their male counterparts.
That's a thought-provoking question and one that deserves further exploration.
Absolutely. But for now, let's shift gears to a president known for his outsized personality and, well, his less than subtle approach to pretty much everything. Lyndon B. Johnson. This is a man who supposedly nicknamed his own presidential endowment Jumbo.
Yes, LBJ was a larger-than-life figure, both literally and figuratively. He was deeply in love with his wife, Lady Bird, but also had a reputation for being quite the womanizer.
And apparently he wasn't shy about using Jumbo to, shall we say, assert his dominance, even in political settings. There were stories about him exposing himself to intimidate rivals or make a point.
He was certainly not known for his subtlety. And perhaps the most famous anecdote involving LBJ and his executive privilege involves Lady Bird walking in on him with a secretary.
Oh no, what happened?
Lady Bird, being the epitome of grace and composure, simply said, "Excuse me," and walked out.
I can't even imagine how awkward that must have been.
Johnson, on the other hand, was mortified. So mortified, in fact, that he had a buzzer installed in the Oval Office so his staff could warn him if Lady Bird was approaching, giving him time to, well, compose himself.
It's both hilarious and a bit cringeworthy. It makes you wonder, did he ever learn from these experiences, or was this just part of his personality?
That's a great question to ponder as we move into the final part of our deep dive.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in our deep dive into presidential sex lives, from the founding fathers to LBJ and his Jumbo personality.
And his buzzer.
Yeah, it's been fascinating and honestly a bit eye-opening.
It definitely challenges that sort of sanitized version of history we get in textbooks.
For sure. And, while we've discussed some pretty scandalous behavior, it's important to remember that not every president has fallen into these traps.
Right, we've focused on the more salacious aspects of presidential history.
Yeah.
But there are plenty of examples of presidents who, as far as we know, maintained fidelity in their marriages and avoided major personal scandals.
Like George Washington. A little crush on a neighbor's wife doesn't exactly qualify as a major indiscretion.
Exactly. And there are couples like Jimmy and Rosalind Carter who were married for over 75 years and had a demonstrably strong and loving partnership.
And the Reagans, too. They seem to have a genuine and affectionate bond that went beyond just politics.
Yeah, it makes you wonder if those presidents who had fulfilling personal lives are often overlooked because their stories just aren't as dramatic or headline-grabbing.
It's true. It's like we're drawn to the drama, the intrigue, the gossip. But maybe there's a lesson in that for us as well. Maybe we should be paying more attention to the presidents who demonstrate integrity and stability in their personal lives, rather than just focusing on those who provide fodder for the tabloids.
It's a valuable perspective to consider. After all, a president's character and personal values inevitably influence their decision-making and leadership style.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive into the sometimes shocking, sometimes hilarious, and always complex world of presidential sex lives, what are some key takeaways for our listeners?
Well, first and foremost, I think we've seen how power can be an intoxicating force. It can lead to inflated egos, a sense of invincibility, and a willingness to take risks that most people wouldn't even consider.
And those risks aren't just personal. They can have serious national security implications, as we saw with JFK's dalliances with suspected spies. It's a stark reminder that a president's actions, both public and private, have far-reaching consequences.
Absolutely. We've also explored how societal norms and attitudes towards presidential scandals have shifted dramatically over time.
Right.
What was once considered off limits for the press is now fair game, thanks in part to events like Watergate and the rise of investigative journalism.
The double-edged sword, though, right?
Definitely.
That shift has also created new challenges like the 24/7 news cycle and the potential for even minor indiscretions to be amplified and distorted on social media.
And let's not forget the persistent double standard that exists for men and women in positions of power. As we've discussed, a woman with a complicated personal life would likely face much harsher scrutiny and judgment than a man with a similar history.
It's a reminder that we still have a long way to go in achieving true gender equality, even in the highest echelons of power.
So as we move forward, it's essential to be aware of these historical patterns and to critically examine how they continue to shape our perceptions of political figures today.
We need to ask ourselves tough questions about what we expect from our leaders, how we hold them accountable, and how we can create a more equitable and just political landscape for everyone.
It's an ongoing conversation and one that requires thoughtful engagement from all of us.
Well said. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the surprisingly revealing world of presidential sex lives. We hope it sparked some new insights and maybe even challenged a few assumptions along the way.
And until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep into the complexities of our world.